The land of Greece is small and mountainous. Now, it's not like Italy's mountains. Italy's mountains are rather low and relatively round. Greece's mountains are tall and hard to get across. So if one city over here decided to go to war against this city, the invading city would lose a lot of its equipment and men climbing the tall mountain, lose a lot more men climbing down the mountain, and lose a lot more equipment. Well, that made it easy for each city-state to defend its own territory. They could, and this kept Greece from uniting. Now, during most of the time period we're talking about, Greece was not united. However, it is believed that way, way back yonder, Greece had been united. Then, during the historical period, they were not united. They were finally united by a foreigner named Philip of Macedon, whom we'll get to later. Philip, the father of Alexander the Great, finally did what the Greeks could never do for themselves. Every time a Greek city-state thought it could unite them, it would always wind up being whipped. Then they finally two sides got together in a battle, and one side was certain to win, except both sides lost. It was a drawn battle, neither side won. And they simply could not unite themselves. But an outsider came in, and they did the job for them. Your chapter opens up with a vignette about Pericles. And yes, I do expect you to remember this name. Now, folks, for those of you who say I should give study guides, if you copy this down, that will serve as an adequate study guide, as I think by now all of you should know. Okay, I see some heads nodding. Maybe not every head's nodding, but I see a few heads nodding. What I'm writing on the board just actually serves as a study guide of sorts. All right, anyway, now, Pericles opened up, the chapter opens up with a vignette on democracy. The occasion was Pericles' city, Athens, was fighting against the city of Sparta, and the city of Athens it was destined to lose. But after the first year of battle, Pericles gave a speech to honor the dead and also proclaim how great democracy is. I'm going to jump ahead of the story a little bit. Thanks to the experiments in democracy by the Greeks, democracy was to receive a very bad name. The Greeks tried it and it failed. The Romans tried it and they failed with it. In every case, the democracy would end when some powerful man would take over, with the approval of most of the people, would take over and say, hey, I'm boss around here and my orders would be obeyed. And the people would wind up liking it because they wound up hating the lawlessness and the indebtedness and the continual strife that democracy seemed to engender. But Pericles was lauding the great values of democracy in the opening vignette. Keep him in mind. I will be coming back to him later.
He was a general?
Pericles was not the general. He was the archon of Athens. He was the top man of Athens. He was over all the armies. He was more than a general.
So he's the king.
The generals were Alcibiades, among others, and Theon, but don't worry about it. We don't go into that much detail. Now, I'll tell you, when I was in grad school, I took a whole course on ancient Greece. Yeah, wait, what's your question? Did I misunderstand you?
No. I was just trying to see what, like, you saying like a ruler or whatever. So what
Yeah.
you call it, what's the title?
With what?
What's the title?
Well, the title was Archon, but don't worry about it. Don't worry about that, because I will not be asking that in the test. So, again, I just want to remind you, I took a course for a whole semester in Greece, and then I took another course on nothing but Athens, Athenian democracy. So I've had a couple of Greek courses. I mean, we could spend the entire semester talking about nothing but Athenian democracy, but we won't do it, except I'm going to say again, democracy wound up getting a bad name among the Greeks because it appeared to lead to chaos and tyranny. All right, back up to the political history first. The earlier part of Greek history occurred on an island right here off the coast of Greece called Crete. Now, don't confuse Crete with Cyprus. But on the island of Crete was the Minoan civilization. The Minoan civilization may have included a lot of mainland Greece also. Now, we know that this island of Crete, now, folks, I have said this before, I'm going to say it again, and of course, repeat it right now. it appears that the Minoan civilization was a very, very highly advanced civilization. They apparently traded as far away as the Indus Valley because some of their products have been found among the Indus ruins, and some of their Indus products have been found among their ruins. They traded with Sumer. They have obviously traded with Egypt, and even as far away as far as Spain. They have, being an island, of course, they probably had a lot of sailboats. They did have writing. Now, unfortunately, their writing has not been deciphered. Their writing was known as Linear A. I won't write that down because I'll say this on a personal note. My very first term paper at UT was on the Linear A script. Some man claimed that he had deciphered it. Well, his decipherment has not been accepted by scholarship even after 40 years. So the Linear A script remains undeciphered, and the reason is we just don't have enough of their writings to where we can be certain of the decipherment. Now, anyway, the Minoan civilization, as your book says, appears to have come to a hard, sudden, abrupt end. Now, folks, some people think that a massive, massive tidal wave hit the Mediterranean and completely covered the island of Crete and wiped out all human and animal life on the island. Be that what it may, I've read some historians and people who study Earth, who think that after the flood, the Earth was more unstable than it is now, and that tidal waves or tsunamis were much worse than they are now. Now, it's only been like, 6 or 7 years ago, a tidal wave hit right here in Indonesia and killed several 100,000 people. I forget what the final figure was, but just killed people by the hundreds of thousands. Tidal waves and tsunamis have been a part of history, and a tidal wave might have destroyed the Minoan civilization. And before it's over with, I'm going to be mentioning Atlantis. I will mention it now. The story of Atlantis is a story about a highly advanced group of people who all of a sudden were buried under the sea. The destruction of the Minoan civilization might have something to do with Atlantis. Again, keep that in mind. Anyway, the Minoan civilization came to an end, and next after them came the Mycenaeans. Now, we at first thought the Mycenaeans were a group of people, we didn't know who they were, until we deciphered their script. Now, they wrote in Linear B, and this I will write down. The Linear B script, if you read it, reminds you a lot of hieroglyphics, but it was linear. I mean, unlike some of the writing which was scroll typed, where they'd read from the bottom up, right to left, bottom up. This was a linear script, but it was difficult to read. Now, we finally deciphered the Linear B script when some men who had been in charge of studying German codes in World War II, once the war was over, we put him and said, hey, decipher some of these ancient scripts. And one man figured it out. I'll get to what he figured in a minute, but I want to say this about the Germans and Japanese in World War II. We were in on their code the entire war. We could read, therefore we knew where they were, where they planned to be. Everything they sent out over the radio, we could pick up and decipher. Now, I was in a combo unit when I was in the Army, and I want to say this about our own government. Our codes change every day. If the enemy picks up today's code, tomorrow the government issues a different one, and they're going to have to decipher it differently. But the Germans had a pretty elaborate code. We were in on it from the beginning. Well, again, the people who had broken their code and the people who broke the Japanese code wound up, we said, hey, see if you can review Linear B. And finally, one man figured it out. It was a surprise to all scholars. Linear B is Greek. Therefore, the Mycenaeans were Greek. And this was a surprise. We now know the Greeks had arrived around 1800 BCE. And folk, here's a story. Something happened up in this region around 1800 BCE that forced these people to move out. The climate may have dried or may have cooled down. The Greeks came down here and settled in Greek. The Latins went into Roman. The Western Europeans, of whom I'm descended, came out here and settled in Western Europe, particularly Germany and Britain, and some of them in Scandinavia. Then another group went down here and settled in Iran. They became the Persians, the Medes. Then another group settled in India. They became the Aryans. We've talked about the Medes and Persians, but all these people got on the move and scattered out from a common origin around 1800 or so BCE, and we don't really know why. But anyway, the Greeks called themselves Mycenaean. They settled in Crete. And it's believed that they might have united all the peninsula of Greece. We don't know that for sure. Now, the Mycenaean period experienced a dark age. Now, it doesn't mean that they were necessarily dark. You know, the word dark age, when it applies to history, means that we don't have any written records of them. Now, Europe went through a period called the Dark Ages, when it looked like learning had been wiped out. The period I'm talking about is from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 400s until the Renaissance in the 1200s. Europe was in what's called the Dark Ages. It was not dark. In the case of the Greeks, somehow or another, they did not seem to have any written records that come down to us, even though we know that during this period, young people grew up, cities were built, they planted gardens, they fought wars, they did all the things that humans do. This was the Dark Age. Now, during the Dark Age, what we know about them mostly comes from the work of a blind poet named Homer. Now, we don't throw everything Homer said out the window. Here's why. We believe that Homer was right when the Greeks, Homer pictured a Greek world where that the highest ideal was to be a soldier, and the highest ideal was to show courage, particularly courage on a battlefield. So they had the values of bravery, courage. All this comes through in Homer's writings. We believe that that actually reflects the mental attitude of the time. But what they didn't have, and what Homer does not have, is the attitude of cooperation and community, which unfortunately the Greeks did not learn about until much, much later, after the time period we're talking about. They lacked the ability to cooperate. They lacked a spirit of community. Honestly, they did have a spirit of community among the local government, called the polis, otherwise known as city-state. Now I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Your book's going to talk about the polis later. From the word polis, we get words like Minneapolis, and my dad grew up in a town that most of you have never heard of called Coraopolis. Many of you, by any chance, heard of Coraopolis in western Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh? Nobody, I'm not surprised. But hopefully all of you have heard of Minneapolis. And if you read the Superman books, Metropolis, again, polis, city-state. Now, in our own history, men like Stonewall Jackson, who did not believe in slavery, when the war broke out, he sided with the South because he was Virginian. In his mind, the state of Virginia was more important to him than to the federal government. Well, the Greeks had the same attitude. Our local city-state is more important to us than the whole country of Greece. Robert E. Lee felt the same way. Now, Robert E. Lee did not like the idea of slavery, even though at one time I know he owned some. But when the war broke out, he said, well, I'm going to defend my state of Virginia, and threw it on the federal government. But they had the attitude that the polis, the city-state, was more important than and this comes out in Homer's writings also. Now, Homer's writings are divided into two poems, the Iliad and Odyssey. And if you notice, I did not print those words. And if you're writing, you should not either. They're titles. Names of ships, titles of books. I mean, you still taught that in English classes? We're supposed to be italicized. They don't teach that anymore? Okay. But they do? They do. All right. At least one person said they still do. Anyway, so titles of songs should be italicized. I believe that's still on the English books. Yes.
If that's on the test, if you don't write it.
And on the test, I don't count off for spelling and grammar. I mean, one of you, this I did count off for. On one of your papers put down about tales, that the ancient people told tales, and they spelled tales T-A-I-L-S. So, I counted off for that. On a test, I just laugh it off. Now, what's the question over here?
Is that first word?
Iliad, I-L-I-L-I-A-D. It's an I. I-L-I-A-D. Odyssey, O-D-Y-S-S-E-Y. Those of you who turned in your papers. Now, folk, the Iliad and Odyssey, like I said, we believe it does reflect the mindset of the Greeks. And it's hard for us in the modern world to imagine how much influence these had. It has been said that Alexander the Great would never go to sleep until he put a copy of the Iliad under his pillow at night, hoping that it would ingrain in him during the night. Now, it won't, folks. It won't. I mean, I can tell you. When I was young, college would try to take tape recorders and tape the professor's lecture while they slept, thinking that somehow it would get ingrained in them, in their sleeping mind. It won't. I can tell you this. Now, hey, recording the lecture might be a great idea, but think you can play it back while you sleep and it'll come back to you when you wake up. Folk, you might even hear it in your sleep, but it won't come back to you when you wake up. But anyway, they would actually, a lot of Greeks memorize these poems. I mean, committed them to memory. They liked them that much. It was like their Bible to them, and they considered them to be serious history, which nobody questioned. Now, in the poem, of course, particularly Iliad, a city is mentioned, or actually the whole thing is about a war between Greece and the city of Troy. The Iliad never really described where Troy was. I mean, after all, if you listen to your weather report, and the weatherman says we're going to have more snow in Massachusetts, the weatherman assumes that you have some idea where Massachusetts is. He won't explain it and tell you, now Massachusetts is located in what is New England, and it's so many miles northeast of Atlanta. I mean, he won't tell you that. Or if you're reading a book and somebody mentions calling on a telephone, they're not going to explain to you what a telephone is or how one works. They assume you know it. In the case of the Homer writing about the city of Troy, I'm just certain he assumed that his reader would know where the place was. He never really described it. However, some scholars in the late 1700s took it upon themselves to find it, and they searched through the Iliad really closely and took some hints what Troy was. And they began to believe it was located right here, because you have to cross the Aegean Sea to get to it. I mean, the Iliad had mentioned that much. And finally, taking some hints from the Iliad, they located it. Now, in the story, the city of Troy was burned by fire. When they found it, the last time Troy was inhabited, it was burned by fire. Read it for yourself. Now, the Iliad ends with a story that after they had fought for 10 years, the Greek soldiers pretended that they were through fighting, and they said to the people of Troy, we're going home. We're going to leave you a gift to honor you for your valiantry, your fighting ability, your bravery. And the gift is this wooden horse. So the people of Troy opened up their gates and let this wooden horse in. In the meantime, the Greek army marched away and got out of sight, just out of sight of the hill. And when darkness fell, the Greek army turned around and went back in. Inside this wooden horse were a bunch of Greek soldiers who went to the city gates, opened up the big gate from inside, it could be opened from inside, and let all of their buddies inside, and they burned the city. And that was the end of Troy. I got a small response from a morning class, but I'm just curious. How many of you have run into the Iliad and Odyssey anywhere? Whether it be high school, anywhere? Hey, most of it. I see most of the hands going up. So you heard this story before. Now, all right. Now, this Iliad and Odyssey contains things that we would call fantastic. There's a story about young Achilles, When Achilles was born, some fortune teller told his mother that this young boy is going to die in battle. Well, the mother went to the gods and said, how can I prevent this? And the god said, if you'll dip him into the river Styx, he'll become invulnerable. So she dipped the baby into the river Styx, except for a heel that she was holding on to. The heel did not get submerged, but she didn't notice that at first. So Achilles grew up and he was basically invulnerable. He became a mighty warrior. But one day he stepped on a sharp stone and somebody noticed, hey, he's bleeding where he stepped on the stone. So this person, his enemy, got an arrow that was poisoned and shot him in the heel with an arrow. And that was the end of Achilles. The point of the story, among other points, being that the fatalism that I talked about before, that's so rife in Greek literature. You know, Greek literature is full of stories about persons who tried to change the will of the gods, only to find that you couldn't. Now, let me hasten to repeat if you don't know already. I'm not trying to push this belief. I must mention because it is a part of Greek literature and Greek mindset, which I must mention, but in no way do I want to espouse it. Yes?
Achilles or Achilles?
I've heard it pronounced Achilles. Now, if you've heard it pronounced, I've heard it pronounced Achilles, but A-R-C-H, the emphasis may be on a different syllable, the way you've heard it. Anyway, that's just one of the stories you find. Gods became involved, and they would fight first on one side and then another. Now, the Odyssey, when the war was over, King Odysseus started to go home. His ship was blown off course and wound up going to all sorts of weird places, including a place called Amazonas, where the women were stronger than the men, and the women did all the fighting, including a Cyclops who had one eye who would eat human beings. And his soldiers took care of the Cyclops, including the Muses who played music so sweet that once you've heard the music, you could never leave. And including stories of strange events, strange people. I did read a book one time where an author felt like that he had determined the route that Ulysses took. It took Ulysses 10 years to get home. That when Ulysses was blown off his course, the storm was so violent that Ulysses was blown out in the Mediterranean and found his way in South America. And the river, the Amazon River he describes is actually the same as the Amazon River, and visited a few various places, and eventually found a way to get back to his homeland. Though he also, on his way, visited a few places in Africa also, but finally found his way. When he got home 10 years later, he was the only survivor. All of his crew had died. Now again, folk, you don't have to believe it. The Greeks looked on these stories as being serious history. I'm going to have more to say about that when you turn your papers in, and especially when you do your second project. All right. Another thing that the Iliad and Odyssey do, they show a society based on agriculture, which we do know to be true. All right. Moving on. I'm looking at page 96. There's the polis here. Polis, as described by the Greeks, meant the city and the territory around it, usually farmland. A lot of times these cities were walled. You know, you have the city and then the walls, with the walls, and then the farmland around it. When an invading army came in, the people inside the city, people in the countryside would flee to the city, but most of the crops were grown in the countryside. And then this area would be surrounded, of course, by high mountains, which would isolate each community from the next. And it gave the Greeks a sense that we're just a bunch of individual, small, isolated communities, and we're not united. Now, they did unite long enough to fight off the Persians, which we'll talk about next. But what's that? The polis. P-O-L-I-S, as I've already mentioned, but I'll mention it again. I'm getting back to where you're back to. Now, the land of Greece is not particularly great as far as horse farming. Therefore, only the wealthier people could could afford to have horses. Horses were extremely expensive. Reason is the horses would eat a whole lot of the grass that was there, and there wasn't that much grass to begin with. So they only a few. What I'm getting at is they had to depend on foot soldiers to do the fighting. The foot soldiers were mostly common men. So to get the common men to fight, they would promise them, if you'll fight this battle for me, we'll give you more rights and privileges. This was to lead to democracy. At least in some, now not in all, but in some city-states. Now, moving on, you come to a new type of warfare, hoplite. The hoplites would line up in a line called phalanx. I'm not going to write the word phalanx down, but I do want you to move the word hoplite. Essentially, your book shows two hoplite armies beginning to engage each other, and on page 98 in my book. The shields overlapped each other. In other words, basically the way that they would line up, most armies would line up to where, now again, I'm going to pretend right now that I'm right-handed, but the soldiers would hold their shield in front of them with their left arm and fight with their right arm. For the hoplites, you held your shield out like this, and your shield protected not you, but your buddy. In the meantime, to your right would be your buddy, and his shield would be protecting you. The idea behind that is you fight as a team. It's not like the American Indians would fight. They'd pick someone who they thought was about their own size and fight him, and then when if they took care of him, they'd go find somebody else who they thought they could beat and go and fight him, and and eventually after a while they'd all get tired, look around and see which side had the most men left, or which side realized they were beat and took off running. In the case of the hoplites, they would line up maybe 5 or 6 deep. In other words, you'd be lined, if you were the front man, there'd be a man behind you and a man behind him, 5 or 6. And if you fell, the next man behind you would come up and take your place. But the idea was you keep a solid wall of shields, wall to wall, and it was very difficult to hurt anybody. Part of the good thing about this is you could fight without losing a whole lot of your men, and most of the men who fought this way wound up returning home. Now, there were some drawbacks to it. A lot of the injuries from it were head and neck injuries, particularly neck injuries, throat, and or growing injuries. And so a lot of people opposed fighting this way. Nevertheless, it became the method that Greeks used for fighting. Now, all right, let's imagine you have a bunch of shields lined up side to side. If you could get around their flank, folk, you had a chance to win. Particularly, it's true since the Greek armor, they only protected their front. They had no protection on their backside. The idea was you keep the enemy in front of you at all times. So they would pick their crack troops, their top troops, and put them here on the flank. And suppose it was an honor to be picked for the flank. Also, these armies had a knack for during a battle, they would keep shifting to the right. Like if you felt threatened, your buddy shifted, you'd shift to the right. Well, when you shift to the right, your buddy would too. But if all of a sudden your buddy shifted to the right, well, you'd have to shift to the right. They kept shifting to the right. And again, it was up to the persons on the far end of the flank to protect their flank. All of which, now this type of fighting only worked when armies were a certain size. When armies got to be really, really, really large, as happened with the Romans, this method of fighting did not work. But it worked when you had armies from small, relatively small city-states engaging each other. And it had to be small enough to where they could hear the shout of the commanding officer, or hear and what you see here on page 98 is a piper blowing his pipe, and the soldiers were trained to know when the piper hit certain beat or certain notes, they would march forward. When a piper hit a certain other beat, they'd step back. And when a piper hit another beat, they'd probably retreat without turning around. You don't want to turn around with these people because you had no protection on your back. But people did run off. The Greeks at one point considered it a disgrace to lose a shield in battle. In other words, the idea you keep hold of that shield no matter what. Now this changed later when one of the Greek aristocrats said, "Yeah, I threw my shield down in battle. Sure I did." He wasn't least bit ashamed. He said, "The reason I did, the thing was in my way. hey, I could get another one. He wasn't a coward. It's just he realized his side was lost. And the only way he had a chance to survive was throw his shield down and turn and run. Which sometimes folk you have to do. He would say, hey, I had to run, so I ran. But as far as my shield goes, I got another one. I came back. He came back and won the next time. But at first it was considered, hey, you throw your shield down in battle, that's a disgrace. That showed up, because after all, I mean, if you threw your shield down, I mean, you could run faster. Because the guys who were winning, they were going to throw their shields down. But oftentimes the losers would. But Aristobulus, don't worry about the name, but he wrote a poem about how, yeah, I threw my shield down in battle. And he wasn't the least bit embarrassed about it. Now, their philosophers began to notice that their government went through cycles. They might start out as a monarchy, go from there to an oligarchy. I'll get to the meaning of that word in a minute. From there to a tyranny. From there to a democracy. And from the democracy to a tyranny again, or maybe to a monarch. Now, the word monarch means the ruler rules by hereditary right. When he dies, he passes it on to his son. A lot of Greek city-states started off as a monarchy. But then you always had the problem of what if the son is incompetent to lead? The father, yeah, he was a good man, but the son would just... So eventually, the monarchy gave way to the oligarchy means ruled by the wealthy, or ruled by the... It's sometimes called an aristocracy. Ruled by a few. In other words, the top people in the city, the richest people in the city would get together and they would govern the city. It would be a council. And they'd say, well, this is better because you now have several people, and if one of them is a louse, the other ones hopefully will make up for it. But these governments all would last a while. Then eventually, finally, someone would come in and say, phooey on these oligarchs, they can't decide anything. And now, the word tyrant in modern English always means a bad person. But in the days of the Greeks, it was not the tyrants were not necessarily bad. Tyranny was just simply a rule by one man who was not a hereditary monarch. He would come in, take over in time of trouble, and oftentimes they would build aqueducts, build roads, and improve the city, build temples to their gods. Not necessarily a bad man at all. Then after the people became tired of having a tyrant tell them what to do, they would eventually form a democracy. Now, if you notice, I wrote the word democracy at the bottom, and that's because the Greeks believed that democracy was the absolute lowest and worst form of government. And all the ancient democracies, including the Roman democracy we'll talk about in the next chapter, wound up failing when a couple of things happened. Well, they might have failed when one thing happened. They were always taken over by some dictator. The Roman Republic ended with Julius Caesar. In the case of other democracies, it ended when people just got tired of the chaos that democracy brings and say, hey, we're tired of high crime. I mean, democracy oftentimes was associated with high crime and also a whole lot of spending and heavy taxes. Now, here's the way that the politicians in the democracy would work. They eventually got to where they would go out to the common people and say, hey, if you will elect me, I will give you this. Some philosophers said to us, made a statement that democracy will work until the ordinary people find that they can dip their hand into the public pot. Who said that? I looked it up recently. We don't know who said it. There is a rumor that a Scottish philosopher said it, but when we looked it up in his writings, we can't find it. I once heard Plato said it, but nobody can find it in Plato's writings. Who said that? We don't know. But you'll hear this from time to time. And under democracy, eventually, the rich get taxed heavily to give to the poor and unsuccessful. And after a while, the whole system comes crashing down because the promises are bigger than the budget can deliver. Does that sound familiar by any chance? Yeah. And the democracy would come crashing down when a tyrant would come in and say, enough of this, from now on, I'm taking over. All right, which takes us up now to the state of Sparta. All right, Sparta. I'll jump a little bit ahead of the story. I mean, newspapers are supposed to tell the back of the story first. We will eventually talk about Athens. I'm talking about Sparta first because your book does. Now, there came about a war between Sparta and Athens. And this war, when I was a kid, reminded me. All right, when I was a kid, the United States was involved in a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, Sparta was involved in a hot war with Athens. I would compare Sparta to the Soviet Union and Athens to the United States. Now, does anybody know what was really bad about that comparison? Athens lost. Maybe, you might not have read that, but Athens lost. Now, I say Athens lost in the short run. Now, fast forward to the year of 2015, and Sparta is no more than a pile of stones. There are 200 people who live in the mountains, and they raise mostly goats and chickens, and they claim that they're descended of the Spartans. Athens has 2 million people, big city. But initially, Athens lost. Now, I'm not saying that means that the United States is going to lose to the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. The United States is all of a sudden fighting a war of words with Russia. I was talking to some fellow part-time faculty. Oh, the United States has not really won any wars since World War II. And the way we fight wars today, we cannot. With that, I'll move on back to the time period we're talking about. Anyway, Sparta. Why would I compare Sparta to the Soviet Union? Simply this. In the city of Sparta, they did not have good farmland. So what they did, they took over this place, the nearby town of Messenia. And unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta and Messenia had no barriers between them. Messenia was on a coastline, Sparta was not, which meant Sparta had no navy. Sparta enslaved Messenians. They called these slaves Helots. And they were to keep these Helots in slavery for some 400 years. Now, eventually the Helots freed themselves. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. Anyway, because they were fearful of a rebellion among the Helots, the Spartans told everybody in their city that they must become a soldier. So here's a story. I'll start with the youngsters. When a Spartan baby was born, and this was true whether it be male or female, the parents were allowed to keep the baby for a month. After a month, the baby was examined by Spartan doctors. If the baby appeared healthy, it was allowed to grow up. If the baby did not appear to be strong and healthy, the parents were told to take the baby outside the city, drop it off, and let the wild animals have it. Now, this practice of exposing babies, folks, was to go on in Western Europe until the arrival of Christianity, when the practice was finally stopped. We were talking in a chapter on Rome about 2 young boys named Romulus and Remus who were dropped off by their parents, exposed, but who survived. Sometimes a few of these babies might have been picked up by the right persons who saved them, but for the most part, now, the idea was the Spartans said, we're going to create a race of super soldiers by only allowing the strong to breed and the weak to die out. Now, folk, this was what Charles Darwin would have agreed with him. There is a problem with it. The Spartans would not allow their people to marry outside the city. You know, we got the best gene pool, if they used the word gene. They said, we have the best gene pool and only our genes are any good. Therefore, we will not mix our genes with the genes outside the city. Now, folk, what eventually happened was they kept marrying among themselves and their population declined until they kept inbreeding, and the result was they created a race of weaklings. If I could go back and tell them, hey, what you people need to do, if you really want to create a race of super warriors, send some of your men to collect wives from India, send some more to collect wives from Spain and Britain, some more to collect wives from here in Africa, and mix in all these diverse genes because, folks, you may have heard, the more diverse your ancestors are, the better the offspring will be. The worst thing you can do is inbreed. Inbreed rabbits, and they'll come out with one leg missing or their insides on the outside, or all kinds of problems. And folks, I don't want to sound racial, but I want to, one of the reasons why that black men make American athletic teams, particularly football and basketball, be more than white is their black ancestry is more diverse than your white European ancestry. Now, if I'm wrong, you can tell me. The more diverse your ancestry, the stronger you'll be. And I would advise, hey, don't breed only among yourselves, because what happens is each family line eventually develops a recessive gene, and that's how we can tell, you know, who you're related to. Thomas Jefferson's DNA was exclusive to him because somewhere they picked up a mutation that only that family line has. And but these mutations stay in a line, and if you breed someone who's really closely related to you, I mean, marry someone who's closely related to you, the offspring will have all your bad genes, and the result will be an inferior set of offspring. Do I make my point, folks? Okay, somebody look like you out. There's a Spartans then without, they made a huge mistake by trying to create a race of super warriors. Now, when the boys were 6, they were taken from their parents' home and put in a military camp. And the training was so rigorous that many of the boys died growing up. There was a story of a boy who captured a fox. I mean, they were not fed as much as they needed to eat. So they're expected to steal the rest of the food. And the idea was, if you get caught, you get whipped. Whether he deserved or not, every Spartan boy was whipped in public at least once a year. Whipping was considered a big part of the training, and the whipping would leave marks on them. But there was a boy who captured a fox and ran into some Spartan officers, and he was afraid that they'd really whip him if they found the fox that he actually had stolen. Well, so while he could steal the fox ate his stomach, and they wound up becoming permanently deformed as a result of the wounds that the fox inflicted on him. But he eventually was able to get away from the officers and kill the fox and eat it. But again, at a terrible price to his physical body. This was a way that they trained their military, but the result was, folks, their numbers kept diminishing and decreasing as time went on, and eventually got to where they couldn't even fight off their own helots. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But they looked on themselves as being the very, very best. Oh yeah, their lawgiver, I must mention, was a man named Lycurgus. It was said that he taught them how to create a military state. And the only professions allowed was soldiers. Art and music, that was considered sissy stuff. We don't have anything to do with that. Dancing, nothing to do with that. Their people were not allowed to visit other cities, and visitors from other cities were frowned on if they came in. They wanted to have their own exclusive state that kept everybody else out. Another reason the population did not grow was the Spartan men were expected to stay in the barracks till they turned 30, and only allowed to live with their wives after they turned 30. It's known that some of the Spartan men might sneak off in the barracks, but the fact is they simply did not have a whole lot of children, all of which contributed to the decline in population. A lot of the children died growing up. Some of the children were killed in infancy, and then they weren't even allowed to conceive the children. Then as time went on, a big earthquake came and destroyed 25,000 of them, and didn't hurt the Messenian helots living nearby. All kinds of things contributed to the decline in population. Then they made a law that the parents had to pay for their children's military education, and hardly any parent could afford it, so the parents would practice birth control just to keep them to pay the big expensive school bill. All of which wound up destroying the Spartan city. Now, there were girls, oh yes, among other things, the girls were expected to dance in front of the city completely naked, and the purpose of this was to desensitize the women. So where women told the men when they left, either come back with your shield or come back on it. In other words, if you're dead, they'll carry you on your shield, but come back with your shield, come back on it. And there's a story in your book about one woman whose husband had died in battle, and they asked her, don't you grieve? She said, oh no, I would grieve. He died the way we're taught to die. He died the way he should have died, And a lot of experts will say this is the absolute worst way to handle the loss of a loved one, to pretend that you have no grief. Go ahead and grieve, go ahead and cry, go ahead and mourn. It's normal and natural, and don't pretend it's not there. But anyway, the idea there, the women would have become completely, totally desensitized. All right. I don't have time to get into it much, but the next city to talk about was Athens. The story of Athens, as we have it written down. Oh yeah, speaking of writing, folk, during the Dark Ages there was no writing, and then the Phoenicians came in, and around 700 BCE, that's when the Dark Age ended. The Phoenicians taught the Greeks to write with an alphabet, and the Dark Age ended with that period. But I'm going to have to stop here. Anybody have any questions? Okay, next test on this will be March 4th. Yes?
For the Odyssey, what we need to know about that, like the Iliad describes war.
Just simply, the Iliad is the war, and the Odyssey is the soldier's trip back home. The word Odyssey still means a long journey. We still use that to describe a long journey.